Family is weird. Family is many people's first point of contact with the rest of the world. You start life as this incredibly small and fragile thing that knows nothing, and ideally, the first experience you ever have is a parent holding you in their arms. And then, over years, you grow up and you start seeing the world from other perspectives. You begin to form your own perspective on things, your own worldview. And sometimes that worldview can differ from that of your family. You can start to feel that distance growing between you and that parent who held you in their arms in your first moments of life, from that most intimate of experiences to feeling entirely disconnected. And many stories have sought to explore that disconnect and find ways to bridge the gap. Many stories have tried to understand what it means to be a family. And many stories have fought tirelessly to prove that family is the most important thing in the world and should be our greatest priority. Then there's the Mitchells versus the Machines. Directed and co-written by Gravity Falls alum Mike Rianda, The Mitchells vs. the Machines is a movie about family. But it's also a movie that acknowledges that family is weird. One of the weirdest connections we as humans will ever have. And not only does it acknowledge that weirdness, it celebrates it by giving us a cast of weirdos to root for as they try their best to stop a robot apocalypse. It's a movie I love, a movie that makes me laugh, a movie that reminds me of the endless creative possibilities of animation, and a movie that at its core is one of the most sincere explorations of that familial disconnect I've ever seen. A movie that subverts the usual understanding of family in these kinds of stories. A movie that acknowledges and celebrates not only the difficult reality, but also the utter weirdness of family. And what I want to do today is talk about two scenes from this movie, two scenes that play back to back and that, to me, define everything this movie is trying to achieve both thematically and emotionally. Two scenes that define two characters, Katie and Rick Mitchell. But before we talk about those two scenes, let's talk about Katie and Rick Mitchell. It's kind of important, actually. Let's start with Katie. Katie Mitchell is an 18-year-old goofball, someone who, by her own admission,
I never fit in. For lots of reasons.
But who found ways to find and express herself through the films that she watched and made, creating art that was unapologetically all her own and a total reflection of her humor, personality, and interests. She's about to go to film school with people that really, finally, get her, because her parents certainly didn't. Her mother, Linda, never really knew how best to interact with her aside from giving her unconditional support, and her father, Rick, existed on a completely different wavelength of interests and priorities. Rick Mitchell is an outdoorsman through and through. He loves the woods and mallards. He is as much a goofball as his daughter, but he's a completely different breed of goofball. And the more that Katie started to develop her own personality and identity, the harder he found it to connect to her. Much harder than it was when she was a kid who had to depend on him. Basically, these two characters are representative of that familial disconnect I was talking about before. A kid growing up to find her own way of viewing the world around her, and a father set in his ways who doesn't understand how to connect with that worldview. So, most of the time, all they do is bicker. Katie wants to leave for film school where people understand her and never come back. And can she really be blamed for that? There's this moment at the beginning of the movie where, after the big dinner blow-up where Rick broke Katie's laptop, Rick goes to talk to her, but then chooses not to, because he sees a wooden moose packed up in a box labeled as give away. The moose he gave to her to help her when she was sad and scared as a kid.
You know how to say I love you in moose language? Let me just... Don't you laugh. Come on, you're supposed to be sad. Hey, come on.
Instead of talking to her, he just sits and watches old home movies lamenting that things aren't the way they used to be. What really defines their relationship is an unwillingness to truly empathize with each other, an unwillingness to really even try to understand one another. And that takes the form of this story about technophobia, because Katie and Rick have two very distinct relationships with technology. Rick wants to blame all of his problems on it, including his disconnect with his daughter, and Katie uses it as a total escape from the things that are bothering her, disabling her ability to actually confront the problem. The thing about Mitchells is that it's certainly not a movie that's trying to say cell phones bad, nor is it on the other end of the spectrum in saying that cell phones and other new technologies are an entirely positive force. It really depicts technology in a very neutral way. Well, technology as we know it anyway. Obviously, the robots trying to shoot humans into space are in the wrong. But otherwise, technology is not in itself good or bad in this movie. Its quality only exists in how humans choose to interact with it, whether it be as a scapegoat or as an escape from reality. Katie and Rick's troubles ultimately have very little to do with cell phones or any other kind of technology. The root of their problems is that the both of them choose instead to focus on that technology rather than who each other are, because it's a whole lot easier to do that than confront the issue at hand. And Mitchell showcases this not just through its depiction of technology, but also in the way that it approaches the theme of family to begin with. There are 2 points that seem rather familiar to anyone who's watched these kinds of movies. That being the big inspirational family speech. Katie gives one at the dino stop telling Rick that she believes in him and still needs him, and that they can save the world together. And Rick gives his own at the Mall of the Globe, where he talks about how this family is the best hope humanity's got, spurred on by that notion that Katie believes in him. But while these big speeches serve to move the family forward, they aren't addressing the real problem. Not only is Katie's speech entirely disingenuous and is simply an attempt by her to get things back to normal.
I was just telling him what he wants to hear. I didn't mean to order that.
But Rick's speech is built on the back of that disingenuousness. It's built on a foundation of insincerity. In other words, even if Rick means it, Katie didn't. And so Rick's speech becomes, by proxy, disingenuous itself, built only on what Rick wanted to hear, that Katie still needs him. In a normal movie like this, it would be those kinds of speeches that would lead to the family uniting to save the day. But here, it's that disingenuousness, that failure to deal with the real issue, that leads to them losing. The Mitchells find themselves sneaking into Pal's main base, and everything is going alright until Pal, in an effort to draw them out, starts talking about how the Mitchells are nothing more than pretenders who can't even be nice to each other without lying, using Katie's disingenuous speech as one of her examples. And suddenly, all the threads start to come loose, and as it all falls apart, what's apparent is just how fragile these familial bonds always were. Just how little it really took for them to snap. And that is what brings me to the first of our 2 scenes. Rick and Linda are captured by Pal's robots, and Katie and Aaron only barely escape, running into the woods and hiding. Aaron, who is just a little kid, remember, is distraught. All he and Linda wanted was for Katie and Rick to finally get along, but it was their inability to do that in a sincere way that ultimately failed all of them. And now they're here in the woods, unsure what to do. And as Katie rifles through her bag, trying to find something to cheer Aaron up, she hands him the old camera she's been using to film this whole time. He opens it up and starts seeing the old footage of the tape that Rick put into the camera the night before they all left. Katie had been recording over them without even realizing it. They start watching together until they come across a video of the last time Rick stood in front of the home of his dreams. Earlier on, we got this bit of info from Linda.
Since I met him, that was his dream, to live in the woods. He loved it up there. But you know, it didn't work out. It just killed him.
We didn't get a reason why there, just that it didn't work out and that Rick was afraid that Katie's dream wouldn't work out either. But here, as we see him taking one last look at that house in the woods he so loved, we get this moment.
I know this is hard for you.
Nah. It's easy.
It's a little unclear exactly what happened. Did they decide suburban living was better for a child than living out in the woods? Could they not afford living so far out because of the costs of raising a kid? But ultimately, the specifics don't matter. What matters is what's obvious. Rick gave up his greatest dream for his daughter, and he did it because he loved her. And at the end, Katie gets to see that he didn't leave it behind entirely.
Something to remember the place by. Come on, Lynn. Turn that off.
That wooden moose from before, that small means of connection that Rick used to help her feel better when she was scared. That way of sharing with her the one thing that mattered to him as much as Katie mattered to him. a reminder that he was willing to do for her what she wasn't willing to do for him. And I'm not saying at all that Katie's problem is that she chose to pursue her dream rather than be what her father wanted. We'll get to that soon, but she was only willing to use his love for her to benefit herself. She manipulated it to try and get back her chance at the life she wanted. In the end, he gave up everything for her, and that doesn't necessarily entitle him to anything. Again, we will get to it, but that kind of love has to mean something. It's the kind of love only seen in a parent's love for their child. And where Katie failed was in using that against him, hurting him because she wasn't willing to take a moment to consider just how much he genuinely did care about her. But Rick isn't without blame. And to understand where he failed, we have to look at our second scene that takes place directly after this one. We find that Rick has been put right next to Mark Bowman, the man behind PAL and the person who enabled all this to happen. And Mark is watching some of Katie's videos online because
these weird girls' videos always cheer me up.
It turns out that Katie's work has had an impact, that her weird art mattered to people. And while Rick takes some amount of pride in that, he's reminded that their relationship isn't doing so well. And as he sits and watches the video with Mark for the very first time, he sees that Katie put a bit more subtext into her art than some may realize. The Sarge character in her Dog Cop movie being a pretty obvious caricature of her father who wants to hold Dog Cop back and won't allow him to be his own person. And we get to a scene that's all too familiar. Dog Cop is going to an academy in California, and the Sarge says that they'll never make it.
I'm a full-grown cop now. And one day I hope that you can get to know the cop that I've become. Because I love you, Sarge. But now that I'm leaving, I just need some backup. And when I look for you, you're not there.
It's here, finally watching this video, experiencing Katie's art, her perspective, that he gets to look outside of himself and see how his own daughter sees him. Not as someone who's scared for her, but as someone who's domineering and controlling, who doesn't want her to be anything but what he wants her to be. He always wanted Katie to meet him where he was, but he was never willing to meet her where she was. For Rick, his daughter was defined not by who she is, but by what she's not. All Katie wanted was some kind of support, the knowledge that no matter what, no matter who else didn't believe in her, her father would. And instead of listening to that, he only ever talked to her about it on the basis that she might fail. In a way, he wanted her to give up her dreams for him the same way that he gave up his for her, as though he deserved her love because of his sacrifices for her. But I think that is precisely what the Mitchells versus the Machines is all about. You don't owe anyone love, not even your family, because love is not a transaction. You don't love someone and sacrifice everything for them because you expect to be loved back. You do it because you love them, every part of them, all their flaws, all that matters to them, all that's weird about them. And when you do love someone, you have to be willing to meet them not where you want them to be, but where they are.
I think maybe in the sequel, Sarge should tell Dog Cop he's always gonna be there to back her up.
That's all I ever wanted.
Humans want to connect with each other. After all, cell phones didn't just appear out of thin air. We made them for the express purpose of enabling connection between ourselves, but that connection is scary sometimes. It's something that can fall apart, and we don't want it to fall apart, so we just do what we can to delay it rather than engaging with it and finding a way to restore it, because what if we don't? And what the Mitchells versus the Machines does is acknowledge that. Acknowledge that family isn't impenetrable and that it's just as fragile a love as any other kind. We can't just give a big speech where we ignore all the problems and find that everything is fixed. We have to look both inwards and outwards, and everyone involved has to work to fix it. I think one of my favorite parts of the movie is actually the end credits, where you get to see the family photos of all the people who worked on the movie. Families that are probably just as weird as the Mitchells, who have probably gone through as many trials as the Mitchells, who have probably struggled to connect with each other as much as the Mitchells. And they're all proof that in spite of all that, these connections are worth something. Because family is weird, and sometimes it doesn't work out the way we want it to, and sometimes that's just how it has to be. There's no shame in that. But it's worth at least trying if you can, because they're the ones who held you in their arms in your first moments of life, and that kind of connection is irreplaceable. You can't change who someone is. You can't make them less weird, or make them love the things that you love, or make them the person that you want them to be. But you can choose to just love and support them anyway. And isn't that even better?